I was gone for just 4 days on a rare shoot in Hawaii, and when I came back, someone had turned my lakeside property into a fully built HOA village. 101 pastel-colored houses, a metal gate community, rules even a newsletter, with my name listed as future tenant. Families were barbecuing, lawn chairs lined the dock I built myself, and the woman in charge looked me straight in the eye and said I had 30 days to get into compliance or get out. That's when I knew this wasn't confusion, it was strategy. Think something like this could happen to you? Tell me in the comments. My name is Nate. I'm 35, and I run a small documentary film studio. This lakefront property is the result of 10 years of non-stop work, where I plan to build a small cabin to relax after long filming trips, Hawaii, Peru, Iceland. Each shoot reminded me why I needed a quiet place like this. I'd been away for 2 weeks shooting a documentary about small-town politics, which honestly felt like a vacation compared to what I came home to. Picture this: you pull into your driveway expecting to see the same peaceful stretch of land you left behind, maybe some fallen leaves or a few weeds. Instead, you're staring at what looks like someone shrunk an entire subdivision and scattered it across your property. I sat frozen staring at a pop-up town of 101 pastel matchboxes. A shiny HOA sign stood right at the old cedar tree line. Cameras blinked at me like they'd been waiting. Each house was perfectly painted in colors that would make a kindergarten teacher weep with joy, complete with miniature mailboxes that actually opened picket fences you could lean on without breaking, and what appeared to be a functional street lamp system. There was even a tiny post office, probably for mailing miniature threat letters to miniature residents who dared to question the homeowners association. And look, a veterinary clinic complete with a little red cross painted on the side. The whole scene had this unsettling perfection to it. It had the same artificial charm as one of those tourist villages in Hawaii, built for influencers, perfect, but soulless. What really got to me wasn't just the absurdity of it all, it was the deliberate nature of every single detail. Someone had spent serious time and money on this project. The tiny sidewalks were actually paved with real concrete, not painted plywood. The streetlights were connected to some kind of underground electrical system that must have required permits and professional installation. These were actual metal signs properly mounted and positioned according to some bizarre traffic code for dolls. Looking back, I should have known this wasn't some random act of suburban madness. This was planned, orchestrated, and executed with military precision. But at the time, I was too busy trying to figure out if I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination to think about the deeper implications. I finally turned off the engine and walked closer to examine the details. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold and should have been my first real warning. There were signs already mounted on trees around the perimeter of my property, official-looking signs with that government font that makes everything seem legally binding. Private property, no trespassing signs. But here's the thing that didn't make sense at the time: they weren't protecting my property from intruders. They were protecting the tiny village from me. Someone had turned my own land into a no-go zone for its actual owner. I'm not even sure why that detail hit me so hard, but it did. It felt like someone had walked into my house, rearranged all my furniture, and then left a note telling me not to touch anything. The fake security cameras were the final touch that pushed me from confused to genuinely unsettled. They were mounted at perfect angles to monitor the entire miniature community, positioned with the kind of precision that suggested someone had spent time calculating sight lines and coverage areas. But they were all facing inward toward my house, not outward to protect against actual intruders. Someone had built a surveillance system on my property to watch me. The cameras looked real enough from a distance, complete with blinking red lights and weatherproof housing, though I suspected they were probably just props designed to intimidate. Maybe I should have just called the police right then and there. I don't know. But I've always been the type to try talking things through before escalating, and I figured there had to be some kind of reasonable explanation for this madness. Then I found the sign that explained everything, or at least pretended to. A large professionally printed placard near what appeared to be the tiny town square, mounted on a post that had been driven deep into my soil without my permission. Community Beautification Project Number 1, sponsored by Lakeside Gardens, HOA. They even described the style as tropical minimalist, as if this place was supposed to be the next Hawaii Airbnb hotspot. Project manager Brenda Morrison. Instead of rage, a strange calm settled over me as I read those words. Those fake cameras and warning signs told me this wasn't random vandalism or some elaborate neighborhood prank. Someone had orchestrated this carefully, and they'd been planning it long enough to get professional signs made and install a functioning electrical system. That's when I heard footsteps on gravel behind me, measured and confident, like someone who belonged here more than I did. I turned around to find a woman in her 50s approaching with the kind of smile that probably worked wonders at church fundraisers but made my skin crawl. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't introduce herself. She pointed to my front steps and said, "You can remove your vehicle or I'll have it towed by noon. You're obstructing HOA maintained access." The sheer audacity of someone telling me to move my car from my own driveway was breathtaking. But what really got to me was the casual authority in her voice, like she was explaining basic physics to a particularly slow child. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process the fact that a complete stranger was issuing ultimatums about my own property while standing in the middle of what appeared to be an unauthorized construction project. If they thought I'd sit back while strangers staked down patio umbrellas on my land, they hadn't met the version of me that survived City Hall for 2 decades. Brenda Morrison lived in what I can only describe as a monument to beige, a house where color had apparently been banned by executive order sometime in the early 2000s. Everything in her house was some variation of tan cream or off-white, arranged like a museum display where human presence felt like contamination. She answered the door wearing a smile so sweet it could have caused diabetes in healthy adults and invited me in like she'd been expecting me for weeks. Maybe she had been. Looking back, I still can't believe how calmly she handled my arrival, like having angry neighbors show up at your door was just another item on her daily schedule. It looked like someone's Pinterest board threw up on my forest. She offered me coffee from a machine that probably cost more than my monthly car payment and gestured toward a spotless living room, where every cushion looked like it had been positioned with a ruler. I declined the coffee mostly because I was afraid touching anything in that sterile environment might trigger some kind of alarm system. Brenda settled into her chair with the practiced grace of someone who'd perfected the art of looking concerned while feeling absolutely nothing. She wielded kindness like a weapon, the sort that made you question your own sanity for objecting to anything so reasonable. When I finally explained why I was there, she tilted her head with this expression of gentle confusion. It was the look of someone who couldn't possibly understand why anyone would object to having their property improved without their permission. "Oh, Mr. Nate," she said, and I noticed she never used my last name like I was some kind of distant acquaintance rather than the property owner she'd just violated in broad daylight. "This is a community project that's been voted on and approved by the proper authorities. Progress doesn't wait for individual preferences, especially when those preferences might conflict with the greater good of our neighborhood." She said it like she was explaining basic math to a particularly slow child. I wish I could tell you I kept my cool at that point. I told her I didn't care what had been voted on by whatever shadow council she'd assembled, that it was my land, and I wanted every tiny house removed within 48 hours, or I'd be calling both my lawyer and the police. That's when she produced the documents, and seriously, did she really have paperwork ready to go? Like she'd been rehearsing this exact conversation in front of a mirror? Brenda reached into a folder that seemed to appear from nowhere, like a magician pulling doves out of thin air, and spread out what looked like official planning approval documents, complete with letterhead signatures and enough legal language to choke a paralegal. There were signatures from neighbors supporting the project, including one that made my stomach drop faster than a broken elevator George from 2 houses down. George was the closest thing I had to a friend in the neighborhood, a retired accountant who'd always seemed like the voice of reason in our little suburban corner of the world. Seeing his signature on those papers felt like discovering your dog had been secretly working for the mailman this whole time. "This whole zone's under declarative use designation," she said smoothly. "You agreed by entering." As you can see, Brenda continued her voice, maintaining that same honey-coated patience. This project has overwhelming community support, from residents who understand the value of neighborhood improvement. She handed me a check for $100, with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for Nobel Prize presentations. $100. Are you renting me for a day or for life? I stared at that check like it might explode if I touched it, wondering if there was some kind of hidden camera recording my reaction for future blackmail purposes. The sheer audacity of offering me money to rent my own property was almost impressive in its boldness, like a pickpocket handing you a receipt after stealing your wallet. I handed the check back with the kind of restraint that should have earned me a medal and repeated my demand 48 hours, then everything gets removed. That's when Brenda's smile shifted just slightly, like someone had adjusted the temperature in the room by a few degrees, and I got my first glimpse of what was hiding behind all that artificial sweetness. She folded the check carefully and placed it back in her folder with the kind of precision that suggested she'd done this exact routine before. I understand you're upset, Mr. Nate, but legal action would be quite expensive for everyone involved, and sometimes the most reasonable path is also the most beneficial for all parties concerned. Sometimes people discover that fighting change is much more difficult than embracing it. It felt like I'd wandered into a HOA-themed episode of Black Mirror. Was that a threat I couldn't tell? And maybe that was the point. The words were polite enough to pass for friendly advice, but the tone carried just enough ice to freeze a small pond. I left her house feeling like I'd just been politely mugged by someone's grandmother, the kind who bakes cookies for church fundraisers and probably has bodies buried in her rose garden. After 48 hours, the houses remained exactly where they were, like a miniature middle finger extended in my direction. Instead, I received a $500 fine notice for violating HOA landscaping regulations that apparently applied to my private property now. She hadn't just invaded my land, she was charging me for the privilege. But what made my stomach drop wasn't the fine print. It was my name scribbled in a handwriting I hadn't used in 20 years. And that's when it hit me. This didn't happen while I was sleeping. It happened while I was in Hawaii, walking beaches and chasing sunsets, thinking I finally had peace. Turns out all it takes is one flight to paradise, for a bunch of pastel-colored nightmares to take root in your backyard. Next time someone tells you to just unplug and take a trip, tell them sure, right after they get a lawyer to sit on their porch for them. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community center, a building that somehow managed to feel both cramped and cavernous at the same time, like it had been designed by an architect who'd never actually seen a room before. The air was thick with stale coffee and self-righteousness, and the walls were decorated with photos of Brenda's artificial smile beside various local politicians, who probably had no idea they were being used as props. I arrived early, hoping to catch George before the meeting started, so I could ask him about that signature without making a scene, but he was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I found myself surrounded by neighbors I barely recognized, all wearing expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to outright hostility. It felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided, and I was just there for the formality of being condemned. Brenda called the meeting to order with the kind of authority usually reserved for Supreme Court justices or elementary school principals dealing with particularly unruly children. She announced that we were there to address a property dispute that threatened the harmony of our community, and I noticed how she managed to make it sound like I was the one causing problems by objecting to having my land stolen in broad daylight. Her ability to spin reality was impressive in the way that natural disasters are impressive, destructive, but undeniably powerful. Then she produced what she called a resident petition supporting the beautification project, and I swear she must have practiced this moment in front of a mirror because her timing was perfect. The petition was complete with signatures from people I'd never even met, residents who apparently lived in our neighborhood, but had somehow remained invisible until they were needed to validate Brenda's latest power grab. The petition requested that the project be allowed to continue indefinitely, and that I be assessed additional fines for my obstructionist behavior. That can't be right, can it? I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one, wondering if she'd completely lost touch with reality. She was holding up a document with dozens of signatures claiming that virtually every household in the neighborhood supported turning my private property into their personal playground. When I asked to examine the petition more closely, like a reasonable person might want to do when being accused of crimes against community spirit, Brenda smiled that practiced smile and explained that HOA documentation was confidential and only available to board members for review. The whole thing felt like being tried for a crime I didn't know I'd committed by a jury that had been handpicked by the prosecutor. If you disrupt the harmony we've built here, it won't just be a legal matter. You'll be remembered as the man who ruined everything, Brenda said. The final blow came when she announced that my fine was being increased to $1,500 and that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a lien being placed on my property. A lien for the crime of objecting to someone else's construction project on my own land. I wish I could tell you I handled that news with dignity and grace, but honestly, I was so shocked I could barely form coherent sentences. Looking back, I should have known that was exactly the reaction she was hoping for, because the more flustered I became, the more reasonable she appeared to everyone else in that room. Just when I thought things couldn't get more surreal, a man stood up with a note card. His voice shook like he was reading under duress. "We just want to preserve the community," he mumbled, glancing nervously at Brenda before sitting back down without making eye contact with anyone. Brenda beamed at him like a proud teacher whose student had just recited the Pledge of Allegiance without stumbling. She motioned to someone off stage, and suddenly, my mic cut out mid-sentence when I tried to respond to what was obviously a rehearsed performance. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. They could speak, but I couldn't. They had voices, but mine had been electronically silenced by people who controlled the equipment and the narrative. After the meeting ended with me officially labeled as a threat to neighborhood harmony, I sat in my car in the parking lot, trying to process what had just happened. That's when George appeared at my passenger window, looking around nervously like he was about to confess to a crime. He got into the car without being invited and immediately launched into an explanation that made everything both better and worse at the same time. "That signature isn't mine," he said without any preamble. "I never sign anything without reading every word at least 3 times, and I sure as hell never agreed to support that circus on your property." I felt like someone had just thrown me a life preserver after watching me drown for the past hour. George had more to tell me, and none of it was going to improve my mood. He told me about the family on Maple Street, the one with the nice garden and the friendly dog. They'd clashed with Brenda over a fence dispute the year before, something about height regulations that escalated into months of legal threats and financial harassment. They'd disappeared suddenly after facing increasing HOA fines and mysterious complications with their mortgage company. I remember them now. They just vanished suddenly one weekend, and I assumed they'd moved away for work reasons. Turns out they were casualties like me, victims of Brenda's systematic campaign to consolidate control over the entire neighborhood, one property at a time. "She's been building this empire for years," George said. "They didn't just steal my land, they hijacked the narrative. That's when I knew I needed to build one louder." I spent 3 days staring at business cards for property lawyers, picking up the phone, and putting it back down again like I was trying to defuse a bomb, but kept forgetting which wire to cut first. The rational part of my brain kept running calculations that made my head hurt: legal fees versus property value, stress versus principal fight versus flight bankruptcy versus surrender. Maybe I should just sell it and be done with it, pack up my dreams of a peaceful lakefront retreat, and find somewhere else to build my little cabin away from the world. I bought this land to find peace after long shoots, not to wage war against a suburban dictator with a filing cabinet full of legal documents and a smile that could freeze antifreeze. But if I surrender now, who becomes the next victim of Brenda's expansion plans? How many other neighbors would watch their property rights evaporate because I was too tired or too scared to fight back? The irony wasn't lost on me that I was hesitating to document my own battle against suburban tyranny when I'd spent years making documentaries about other people's fights against corruption and abuse of power. I've covered plenty of David versus Goliath stories for my work, interviewing people who'd stood up to corporations, government agencies, and various other institutional bullies, but I never thought I'd be living in one of those stories myself. There's something different about being the protagonist instead of the observer. Sarah's law office was nothing like Brenda's sterile living room museum. Books were stacked everywhere, in precarious towers that defied both gravity and organizational logic. Legal briefs covered every available surface, like snow after a particularly violent blizzard, and she greeted me with the kind of intense focus that made me feel like I was the most important case she'd ever handled. Within minutes of reviewing my documentation, she was asking questions I hadn't even thought to consider, questions that revealed layers of complexity I'd been too overwhelmed to notice. "This isn't just a property dispute," she said, spreading my photos across her desk, like evidence at a murder trial. "This is organized extortion disguised as civic duty." Sarah revealed herself through sharp analysis, dissecting the case files with surgical precision and quickly identifying the real game Brenda was playing behind all the community beautification rhetoric. What I thought was random harassment motivated by control issues was actually a sophisticated system of financial manipulation designed to transfer property ownership through legal technicalities and bureaucratic warfare. Sarah circled 3 clauses in silence. They're using a legal loophole that treats your land like an unclaimed communal corridor. It's niche, but beatable. When someone leaves items on your land and ignores removal notices, ownership can transfer to the landowner under certain circumstances, but the process requires specific legal steps and documentation that most people don't know about. She was already 3 steps ahead of me, seeing legal angles and strategic possibilities that hadn't occurred to me in my weeks of frustration and sleepless nights spent wondering if I was losing my mind or just my property. I wasn't sure if I was overreacting to feel hopeful for the first time since this whole mess started, but Sarah's confidence was infectious in the way that competence often is when you've been drowning in your own ignorance and desperation. Then she showed me something on her computer screen that made my blood boil all over again. Something that transformed my anger from a simmer to a full rolling boil that threatened to blow the lid off my remaining self-control. She'd found the HOA newsletter online, and there was Brenda's smiling face under a headline that read, "Support the Tiny Village Project. Goal $10,000 to expand this recreational space for our entire community." She was crowdfunding improvements to my property without permission, soliciting donations from the entire neighborhood and probably beyond to make her theft permanent and profitable. This crosses into fraud territory, according to Sarah's analysis, because she was raising money based on false claims about property ownership and community authorization. Not only had Brenda invaded my land and charged me for the privilege, she was now asking for donations to enhance the experience and expand the project to include additional features that would make removal even more complicated. I actually had to stand up and pace around Sarah's office after reading that newsletter, trying to work off the kind of rage that makes people do things they see on the evening news later. The sheer audacity was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. Brenda had taken my private property, turned it into a public attraction, charged me fines for objecting, and was now asking for donations to enhance the experience for everyone except the person who actually owned the land. It was like someone stealing your car, charging you storage fees, and then starting a crowdfunding campaign to upgrade the sound system for their own enjoyment. Sarah watched me pace like a caged animal, and then delivered the line that changed everything. They're hosting a summer festival this weekend to celebrate the project and raise more money. Recording in public spaces is perfectly legal in this state, and public statements made at fundraising events can be used as evidence in court. The plan Sarah outlined was elegant in its simplicity and potentially devastating in its effectiveness. We would attend the festival as concerned community members, legally record any admissions of wrongdoing, and document the extent of the fraud for both civil and potentially criminal proceedings. She handed me a small recording device that looked like something from a spy movie and explained the legal boundaries of what we could and couldn't do without crossing into illegal surveillance territory. Sarah looked me dead in the eye. "If you want to bring this down, you don't take them to court. You turn their own bylaws into a trap." I had a strategy now, a real plan with legal backing and professional guidance, but walking into Brenda's festival felt like entering the lion's den with a pocket full of raw meat. By the time I reached my truck, I'd already drafted 3 moves in my head. If they played HOA theater, I'd write the script. Would I get the evidence I needed to destroy her little empire? Or would I become the next cautionary tale? I didn't just want my land. I wanted a record, public and permanent, of how they'd tried to rewrite reality. The HOA festival smelled like funnel cake and artificial order. I was already inside, badge-clipped camera rolling. Brenda had transformed the area around my tiny village into a full carnival, complete with food trucks selling overpriced corn dogs, a bounce house for kids that probably violated several safety regulations, and a stage where she held court like some kind of elected official, celebrating a major policy victory. The whole neighborhood seemed to be there, along with people I didn't recognize who must have come from other parts of town. After seeing the fundraising posts, or hearing about the amazing new community project from friends and family members who'd been recruited as unpaid marketing ambassadors, I couldn't believe how many people had shown up to celebrate the theft of my property. How many families were taking photos of their children playing in my stolen paradise, while I stood there with a recording device in my pocket, like some kind of undercover investigative journalist working a story about municipal corruption. Looking back, I still can't believe I walked right into the middle of it with evidence-gathering equipment, but sometimes the best hiding spot is in plain sight, especially when everyone expects you to be angry and confrontational rather than calm and methodical. The festival had that surreal quality that makes you question whether you're living in reality or some kind of elaborate social experiment designed to test your sanity and your faith in human nature. Sarah had positioned herself near the stage with a professional camera, pretending to be a freelance journalist covering community events for some imaginary publication that existed only in her backstory. The beauty of her plan was that everything we were doing was completely legal and normal, the kind of documentation that happens at public events every single day across America. People record public events all the time, and Brenda was actively encouraging documentation of her big success story, probably planning to use the footage for future fundraising efforts and promotional materials that would expand her empire beyond our little neighborhood. I mingled with the crowd, making small talk with neighbors and strangers, listening for anything that might be useful in court, later while trying not to look like someone gathering evidence for a federal investigation. Most people seemed genuinely excited about the project, talking about how creative and beautiful it was, how lucky the neighborhood was to have someone like Brenda who cared enough about community improvement to organize something so ambitious and visually appealing. Part of me wondered if I was the crazy one for being upset about this whole thing, if maybe I should just accept that my property had been improved without my permission and learn to appreciate the artistic vision that had transformed my boring lakefront into something that brought joy to families and children. But then I remembered that appreciation doesn't pay property taxes or mortgage payments, and community joy doesn't compensate for the violation of having your private space turned into a public attraction without your consent or compensation. A woman near the cider booth whispered, "They told us not to talk to anyone with a clipboard." Then she smiled too wide and walked away, leaving me to wonder how many other residents had received similar instructions about maintaining the carefully crafted narrative of unanimous support. The undercurrent of control was becoming more obvious the longer I watched, like noticing the strings on marionettes once you know what to look for. Children played happily in the bounce house, while their parents exchanged glances that suggested they knew more than they were willing to say out loud, creating an atmosphere of enforced cheerfulness that felt increasingly sinister the more I observed it. She tapped her glass. All the conversation stopped. Brenda commanded the crowd like royalty addressing her subjects, basking in the adoration of neighbors who applauded her every word like she was announcing the cure for cancer or the end of traffic jams forever. "Thanks to your generous contributions," she announced with that same honey-coated voice I'd come to despise, "we've expanded the project to include the beautiful lakefront area, creating enhanced recreational opportunities for everyone in our community and beyond." There it was clear as day and recorded for posterity on multiple devices. She had just admitted to a crowd of witnesses that she'd used donated money to expand the project onto private land without the owner's permission. My private land, my stolen property that had been democratically redistributed for the greater good. I was so focused on getting every word recorded clearly that I almost didn't notice when Frank Morrison approached me from behind like a predator stalking prey through tall grass at a nature preserve. Brenda's husband was everything I'd expected, based on her description and more designer polo shirt that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget gold watch, that caught the sunlight like a beacon of affluence, and the practiced charm of someone who'd perfected the art of friendly menace through years of intimidating people who couldn't fight back. His hand found my shoulder with just enough pressure to communicate intent without crossing into assault territory. A touch that said I could hurt you, but I'm choosing not to, in the universal language of bullies and loan sharks everywhere. "You should be careful," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise and the sound system that was broadcasting his wife's speech to the entire neighborhood and probably being recorded by half a dozen phones. This neighborhood can be dangerous for people who don't know how to keep quiet about things that don't concern them directly. Sometimes people who cause problems find that their problems multiply in unexpected ways, if you know what I mean. Was he seriously threatening me at a public festival, in front of dozens of witnesses and at least one professional camera that was actively recording everything? The audacity was almost admirable in its complete disregard for consequences or common sense, like watching someone rob a bank while wearing a name tag and a GPS tracker. But Frank had more to say, and what came next was even more chilling than his initial threat about neighborhood dangers. He pulled out his own phone with the casual confidence of someone who'd been planning this moment for days or weeks and showed me a video of myself walking around the HOA common area late one evening the week before. I'd been checking to see if anyone was maintaining the tiny houses, just trying to understand the scope of the project and whether it was a permanent installation. But in the video, it looked like I was casing the place for some kind of vandalism or sabotage operation. The angle and lighting made my innocent curiosity look suspicious and potentially criminal, like security footage of a burglary suspect preparing for a break-in. Trespassing after hours can be a serious offense. Frank continued his smile, never wavering despite the menace in his voice, especially when there's video evidence of suspicious behavior that suggests criminal intent toward community property. People who make trouble for the community sometimes find that trouble has a way of following them home, creating problems they never anticipated. His threat carried the weight of someone who had made good on such promises before, someone who understood exactly how to destroy a person's life, using legal technicalities and social pressure applied in just the right places, with just the right timing. My camera caught a man stuffing unused ballots into a locked HOA box near the refreshment table. He noticed me watching. He walked toward me, smiling with the same artificial warmth that seemed to be the neighborhood's official expression. I maintained my smile and nodded politely, but every nerve in my body screamed danger, like a fire alarm in a building full of gasoline and open flames. This wasn't just about property disputes or HOA politics anymore, if it ever had been. The Morrisons were playing a much more serious game with much higher stakes, and they'd been documenting my every move just as carefully as I was documenting theirs, except they'd had a head start and professional experience in destroying people who crossed them. If someone threatened you like that, would you back down or fight harder? I called Sarah immediately after Frank walked away, my voice betraying none of my composure despite my racing heart and the adrenaline that was making my hands shake like I'd had too much coffee. Sarah's response chilled me even more than Frank's threats. Perfect. He just escalated this from civil to criminal. Now we can destroy them completely and publicly. Her confidence should have reassured me, but instead I wondered if I was ready for whatever destroying them actually meant in practical terms. I had what I needed. But so did they. Footage of me inside uninvited, posing as a resident. If I lost this game, I'd lose it publicly. Sarah and I spent the next 2 weeks preparing what she called our nuclear options, a legal strategy so comprehensive and devastating that it would make Sherman's march to the sea look like a friendly neighborhood stroll. She'd been in contact with the county recorder's office, the state attorney general's fraud division, the IRS, about potential tax implications of Brenda's crowdfunding activities, and probably several other agencies that I didn't even know existed, but apparently took a dim view of people who stole property and then bragged about it at public festivals. The amount of paperwork involved was staggering, towers of documentation that made me understand why lawyers charge so much and why legal battles can drag on for years. I'd never imagined how much destruction a simple signature could unleash, but watching Sarah work was like watching a master craftsman build something beautiful and terrible. The first step was establishing my clear legal ownership of the property, which should have been straightforward, but turned into a bureaucratic nightmare that lasted for days. The HOA had filed their own documentation, claiming the land was part of the common area, complete with surveys and legal descriptions that made it sound like they'd owned it since the dawn of time. There was a brief moment when I thought we might lose everything on a technicality, some obscure zoning regulation or property law loophole that would invalidate my claim and leave me with nothing but legal bills and the satisfaction of knowing I'd tried to fight back. Sarah had to dig through decades of property records going back to the original land grants and development agreements to prove that my lot ownership predated the HOA's establishment by 15 years. For 2 days, it looked like the application might be rejected for lacking clear legal proof of original ownership, and I nearly despaired completely. Maybe I should have just walked away from the beginning, taken the loss, and found somewhere else to build my dreams of a peaceful lakefront retreat. I don't know. The uncertainty was eating at me like acid, making me question every decision I'd made since finding those tiny houses on my property. But Sarah refused to give up working 18-hour days and calling in favors from colleagues and former professors, and her persistence saved everything. She found the original deed, the survey markers, and enough documentation to prove beyond any doubt that the land belonged to me and had never been part of the HOA's jurisdiction or authority. Once we established ownership beyond any reasonable doubt, Sarah executed the second part of her plan with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Under state abandoned property laws, items left on someone else's land after proper notice has been given can legally become the property of the landowner, and since Brenda had ignored multiple removal demands and had actively expanded the project, every single tiny house now legally belonged to me. The law was beautifully simple in its logic. Ignore removal notices for items on someone else's property, and those items become that person's property through a process called adverse possession of abandoned goods. Brenda had essentially donated 101 miniature houses to someone she was trying to destroy, turning her weapon against me into my weapon against her. But Sarah's masterstroke was what came next, the legal maneuver that transformed everything from a defensive battle into an offensive victory. Sarah handed me a clipboard and said, "You're the artist. This is your opening." I stapled the laminated statement to a wooden stake and drove it into the soil at the edge of house number 7. Instead of demanding removal or destruction of the tiny houses, which would have given Brenda the satisfaction of seeing her work destroyed, I filed paperwork registering the entire collection as an art installation called Portrait of Suburban Tyranny. This transformed what had been Brenda's weapon against me into my weapon against her, creating legal ownership of an art piece worth potentially tens of thousands of dollars, created entirely through her illegal activities and funded by her fraudulent crowdfunding campaign. The documentation Sarah prepared was ironclad, a legal fortress built from audio confessions, evidence of fraudulent fundraising, and ownership documents that predated the HOA's entire existence. Frank tried to file a countersuit claiming that the houses were HOA property and that I was stealing community assets through some kind of legal technicality that violated the spirit, if not the letter of property law. His lawyer probably charged him thousands of dollars to file paperwork that lasted exactly 3 days before being dismissed by a judge who took one look at our documentation and suggested that Frank might want to consult with a criminal defense attorney instead of pursuing civil remedies that had no basis in reality or law. The power of properly filed paperwork was something I'd never fully appreciated before this experience. I'd reclaimed every inch of my land, including the bizarre structures they'd erected on it, and transformed the whole mess into a legal asset that put me in complete control of the situation for the first time since this nightmare began. The final piece of Sarah's strategy involved simultaneous notifications to multiple agencies and media outlets, a coordinated information campaign that would expose Brenda's activities to law enforcement, tax authorities, and public scrutiny all at the same time. She yanked her HOA sash off mid-sentence and snapped at George loud enough for nearby vendors to freeze mid-transaction. Brenda received the ownership transfer notice and laughed mockingly, announcing to anyone who would listen that she'd send people to clean up the mess on Monday morning and that I'd be hearing from her lawyers about theft charges. She had no idea that Sarah and I had already sent our complete file to the press, the state attorney general, and the IRS for investigation of tax fraud related to the crowdfunding activities that had raised money based on false claims about property ownership and community authorization. She backed away from the installation sign like it was radioactive. Behind her, 2 residents quietly tore down a HOA event poster. Brenda thought she was playing chess, moving pieces around a board where she controlled all the rules and had the power to declare victory whenever she felt like it. She had no idea I'd just overturned the entire board, scattered the pieces, and invited federal authorities to investigate whether her game had been legal in the first place. Sarah flipped open her phone and live-streamed the HOA stage. This is now a disputed zone, she narrated. Under county law, all uses are frozen pending cultural review. But would checkmate feel as satisfying as I hoped, or would victory taste different than I imagined? I walked away from the stage and into a crowd of journalists Sarah had invited. They were waiting for my statement. I had one line ready. The emergency HOA meeting Brenda called to address the crisis turned into the most satisfying 2 hours of my entire adult life, a masterpiece of public humiliation that unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of justice and revenge. She had intended it to be my public exile from the neighborhood, a final demonstration of her power and my helplessness that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider challenging her authority in the future. Instead, it became her complete and very public downfall, witnessed by neighbors, reporters, and law enforcement officials who'd been quietly investigating her activities based on the evidence Sarah and I had provided. The community center was packed beyond capacity, but not just with neighbors who'd come to watch the show. Sarah had quietly arranged for local news crews to cover what she'd pitched as a story about grassroots community organizing and property rights disputes. The reporters had no idea they were about to witness the collapse of a suburban dictatorship, the kind of story that would make headlines and generate follow-up investigations into HOA abuse and corruption throughout the state. Brenda opened the meeting with her usual commanding presence, but I could see cracks in her composure that hadn't been there before. Tiny signs of stress and uncertainty that suggested she was beginning to understand that something had changed in the balance of power. She announced that a rogue property owner was threatening legal action against the entire community, and that decisive action was needed to protect everyone's interests from someone who valued individual property rights over community harmony and shared prosperity. The irony was beautiful in its completeness. She was absolutely right that decisive action was needed, just not the kind she had in mind or the kind that would benefit her cause. When she called on me to explain my objections to the project and justify my selfish opposition to community improvement, I stood up with a folder full of documentation and a smile that probably looked as predatory as it felt. The silence in that room was absolute, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat and the sound of your clothes moving when you breathe. You could have heard a pin drop as I began to explain the legal reality of what had happened to my property and what was about to happen to theirs. "I don't need to destroy what they built illegally," I announced to the packed room, my voice carrying clearly without the need for the microphone that Brenda had been using to project her authority. "I'm simply claiming ownership of what legally belongs to me under state abandoned property laws." The silence that followed was even more complete than before, broken only by the sound of cameras clicking and the barely audible whisper of someone asking their neighbor what abandoned property laws meant. I explained how property law worked, how Brenda's refusal to remove the structures after proper legal notice had transferred ownership to me, and how their fundraising activities based on false claims constituted fraud under both state and federal law. Then I held up the official registration documents for Portrait of Suburban Tyranny, an art installation now legally valued at $25,000 and scheduled for auction within 30 days, with all proceeds going to establish a legal defense fund for victims of HOA abuse and corruption. The gasps and murmurs that rippled through the crowd were music to my ears, the sound of people realizing that the tables had turned completely and that the victim had become the victor through patience planning and superior legal strategy. Brenda's reaction was everything I'd hoped for, and more, a complete meltdown that destroyed any remaining illusion of competent leadership or rational authority. She shrieked about lawsuits and constitutional rights, demanding to know how anyone could steal community property and turn it into personal profit through legal technicalities and bureaucratic manipulation. The beautiful thing was that everything she said just proved she didn't understand property law or the legal consequences of her own actions, and her public tantrum was being recorded by multiple cameras for broadcast on the evening news. Frank tried to intimidate the reporters stepping toward them in that menacing way he'd perfected through years of bullying people who couldn't fight back. But the police were already there waiting for him with handcuffs and a warrant based on the evidence Sarah had provided about his threats and intimidation tactics. George shouted, "That's not my signature," then paused when shown a printout of a digital wire transfer. He tried to laugh. No one joined. The floodgates opened after Frank was led away in handcuffs, while news cameras captured every moment of his perp walk for posterity and public consumption. Neighbors who'd been silent for years started speaking up about Brenda's historical abuses stories, pouring out about forced property modifications, illegal fines, and families who'd been driven out of the neighborhood through harassment and financial manipulation that made my experience look mild by comparison. George stood up and described how his signature had been forged on multiple documents, and 3 other residents confirmed that their names had been used without permission on various HOA paperwork. The woman who ran the local hardware store revealed that Frank had been buying supplies with HOA funds and billing them to private accounts, essentially stealing from the community to fund his wife's projects and their personal lifestyle improvements. A retired teacher described how Brenda had tried to force her to remove a garden that had been planted before the HOA even existed, using fake architectural guidelines and fabricated neighbor complaints to justify fines that had nearly forced her into bankruptcy. The stories kept coming, a cascade of abuse and corruption that painted a picture of systematic exploitation that had been hidden behind smiles and community service rhetoric for years. The HOA board, composed of people who'd been too intimidated to challenge Brenda, before this moment unanimously voted to remove her from all positions and dissolve her authority immediately. George volunteered to serve as interim president, while they reorganized under new leadership focused on actual community service rather than power games and property acquisition through legal manipulation. A child tugged at her sleeve and asked, "Are you in trouble now?" Brenda didn't answer. Her HOA badge fell to the grass. Brenda left the meeting in absolute silence, walking through a crowd of neighbors who'd once feared her, but now looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust. No one acknowledged her departure, no one said goodbye, or wished her well. 2 weeks later, Brenda and Frank faced multiple charges, including fraud, intimidation, tax evasion, and conspiracy related to their misuse of HOA funds and crowdfunding money that had been raised through false representations about property ownership and community authorization. 1 month later, new HOA leadership under George passed comprehensive anti-abuse policies that limited fines, required transparent voting, established an appeals process for all decisions, and created oversight mechanisms to prevent future corruption. 3 months later, my art auction raised $25,000, which I donated to establish a legal defense fund for victims of corrupt HOAs throughout the state, turning Brenda's theft into a resource for fighting similar abuse in other communities. 6 months later, with the tiny houses finally removed and the natural landscape restored to its original beauty, I was sitting in my new cabin overlooking the pristine lake I'd originally fallen in love with. The silence wasn't peace, but it wasn't HOA music either. For now, that was enough. In the end, Brenda did leave a legacy, just not the one she envisioned. She became a living reminder that unchecked power inevitably destroys itself, and that sometimes the best way to defeat tyranny isn't to tear it down, but to expose it to sunlight and let everyone see it for what it truly is. Turns out nothing draws viewers like a town that was never supposed to exist. I still drive past the edge of that old property, sometimes just to remind myself it's really over. The signs are gone, the cameras are gone, and so is Brenda, at least from any position of authority. Maybe the real lesson here is that you don't always need to knock on doors to reclaim what's yours. Sometimes you just need paperwork, patience, and a very public record. If you're still here, I'd love to hear your take in the comments. Ever tangled with a HOA? If you liked this one and want to support the channel, you can always hit the little thanks button below. Catch you in the next one.
This story might be over, but QA Stories has a whole vault of mayhem waiting. Choose your next rabbit hole wisely.